Welcome to one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Georgia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. In the sweltering summer of 1853, plantation owners across 3 counties in central Georgia began dying under circumstances that authorities could only describe as unnaturally similar. Each man had recently purchased the same enslaved woman, a 24-year-old named Delilah, whose extraordinary beauty was noted in every bill of sale and whose presence in each household preceded death by mere weeks. The pattern would not be recognized until a county clerk, organizing estate records in 1854, noticed her name appearing repeatedly in both purchase documents and subsequent death certificates. This is her story. The first death occurred on June 27, 1853, at the Hargrove Plantation in Baldwin County, where Silas Hargrove, a prosperous cotton planter of 46 years, collapsed in his study precisely 3 weeks after acquiring Delilah at the Augusta slave market from a traveling trader for the sum of $1,800. Dr. Edmund Cartwright, the attending physician whose detailed case notes would later be donated to the Medical College of Georgia in 1902, recorded in his journal that Hargrove exhibited violent stomach distress, convulsions that required 3 men to restrain him, a relentless fever that resisted all conventional treatments, including repeated bloodletting and cold compresses, and a disturbing blackening of the fingernails and lips that defied any diagnosis within his considerable medical experience. The burial took place with unusual haste on the morning of June 29th, attended by a notably sparse gathering of neighbors and family, and it was during the brief reception following the service that Margaret Hargrove made statements to several witnesses that would later be preserved in their personal correspondence. A letter written by her neighbor, Constance Whitfield, dated July 1st, and discovered among estate papers in 1967, noted that Margaret had spoken of how her husband had become unrecognizable in those final weeks, spending his nights away from the main house and returning at dawn with mud on his boots and a wildness in his eyes that frightened even the overseer. It was on the afternoon of March 14, 1854, in the cramped second-floor office of the Baldwin County Courthouse, that Josiah Pemberton, a meticulous clerk of 32 years, who had maintained county records with an almost obsessive attention to detail since his appointment in 1847, began the routine task of organizing estate settlement documents that had accumulated over the previous tumultuous year. The office, with its tall windows overlooking the town square and its walls lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes of deeds, wills, and certificates, had always been Pemberton's sanctuary, a place where the chaos of human affairs could be reduced to orderly columns of names and dates and properties transferred from the dead to the living. As he arranged the documents chronologically on his broad oak desk, a name began to appear with a frequency that caused him to pause in his work, his hand hovering over a bill of sale dated August 3rd, 1853. Delilah, no surname recorded, described in the trader's notation as a mulatto woman of approximately 24 years, appeared not once or twice, but 5 separate times across documents spanning from June 1853 to January 1854, each appearance corresponding with a property transfer following the death of a plantation owner. Pemberton retrieved more documents from the archives, spreading them across every available surface in his office, and the pattern that emerged sent a chill through him despite the warmth of the March afternoon. Silas Hargrove of Baldwin County, deceased June 27, 1853, had purchased Delilah on June 4th. Robert Finch of Putnam County, deceased July 31, 1853, had purchased her on July 12th. Daniel Ashworth of Putnam County, deceased August 29, 1853, had purchased her on August 6th. William Thornbury of Hancock County, deceased on November 18, 1853, had purchased her on October the 9th. Cornelius Wade of Baldwin County, deceased January 22, 1854, had purchased her on December 30th, 1853. That evening, by candlelight, Pemberton began a private ledger that he would keep locked in his desk drawer, writing across the top of the first page a question that would haunt him for months to come. What manner of woman leaves 5 dead men in her wake? The first documented appearance of Delilah in Georgia occurred on February 17, 1853, at the weekly slave auction held in the central market square of Augusta, where a traveling trader named Horace Mullins brought a coffle of 11 enslaved people he claimed to have purchased from the liquidation sale of the Brennan estate near Charleston, South Carolina, following the death of its owner under circumstances Mullins described only as sudden and unfortunate. The auctioneer's ledger, a remarkably preserved volume, discovered in 1891 by local historian Samuel Crittenden during his research into antebellum commercial practices, and now housed in the Augusta Historical Society archives, contains detailed notations about each person sold that day. But the entry for Delilah stands apart in both length and tone from all others. The auctioneer, a man named Virgil Stokes, noted that she stood approximately 5 feet, 6 inches tall, possessed skin the color of light honey that suggested mixed ancestry, had eyes described as an unusual shade between green and gold, and carried herself with what multiple witnesses in their later testimonies would characterize as an unsettling composure that seemed almost aristocratic. Stokes recorded in his ledger that when Delilah was brought to the auction block, still wearing the plain homespun dress provided by Mullins, a strange silence fell over the assembled crowd of planters, overseers, and traders, broken only when the bidding commenced at $800 and rapidly escalated beyond what anyone present had witnessed for a single female slave in recent memory. The bidding war that ensued involved 6 wealthy plantation owners, including Silas Hargrove, Robert Finch, and a prominent Savannah merchant named Theodore Blackwood, with the price climbing in increments of $50 and then $100 until Mullins himself, in an action Stokes noted as highly irregular, withdrew Delilah from the block at $2,000 and announced he would consider private offers after the auction concluded. In the days that followed, according to receipts that would surface in various estate records over the next 18 months, Mullins sold Delilah privately to Hargrove for $1,800, a transaction completed on June 4, 1853, though why Mullins reduced the price and what transpired in the 4 months between the auction and the sale remains a mystery buried in the gaps of the historical record. The most revealing piece of evidence concerning Delilah's origins would not surface until the spring of 1923, when a graduate student named Margaret Osgood, conducting research for her thesis on antebellum trade routes at the University of Georgia, discovered a letter tucked between the pages of a church record book from the First Methodist Church of Columbus, Georgia, dated November 3, 1869. The letter, written in the shaking hand of Reverend Nathaniel Pierce, documented a deathbed confession given by Horace Mullins, the trader who had brought Delilah to Georgia 16 years earlier, as he lay dying from consumption in a boarding house on Broad Street. According to Reverend Pierce's account, Mullins had requested the minister's presence in his final hours because the burden of what he knew had become, in his own reported words, heavier than any chains he had ever fastened to human flesh. The confession revealed that Mullins had indeed acquired Delilah from the Brennan plantation outside Charleston, but not through any ordinary estate sale, as he had claimed to buyers in Augusta. Thaddeus Brennan, a wealthy rice planter of 53 years, had died in October of 1852, under circumstances that the local physician described as identical to those that would later plague the Georgia planters, including the violent convulsions, the inexplicable fever, and the blackening of the extremities that suggested poison but could never be proven. Mullins reportedly told Reverend Pierce that he had purchased Delilah directly from Brennan's widow, who had begged him to take the woman as far from Charleston as possible, offering her at a fraction of her value and refusing to speak the reason for her desperation beyond a cryptic warning that death followed in that woman's shadow. The letter concluded with Mullins's statement, carefully transcribed by Reverend Pierce, that from the moment he had taken possession of Delilah, he had sensed something profoundly wrong, a darkness that seemed to emanate from her very presence, and that he had sold her to Hargrove not for profit, but to be rid of her before that darkness consumed him as well. The death of Robert Finch on July 31st, 1853, marked the second in what would become a horrifying sequence, though at the time his demise was viewed as a tragic coincidence rather than part of any discernible pattern. Finch, a bachelor planter of 38 years who managed a modest but profitable cotton operation of 600 acres in Putnam County, had purchased Delilah on July 12th from the estate auction of Silas Hargrove for the sum of $1,600, a price documented in county transfer records that suggested he saw value where others at the auction had hesitated. The progression of his illness, as recorded in letters written by his sister Abigail, who had been visiting the plantation during those final weeks, mirrored Hargrove's decline with disturbing precision, beginning with complaints of severe headaches and progressing rapidly to the violent stomach distress, uncontrollable tremors, and the same mysterious blackening of the fingernails that had so puzzled Dr. Cartwright. Abigail's letters, preserved by her descendants and donated to the Georgia Historical Society in 1958, describe how her brother had become increasingly withdrawn and agitated, spending hours alone with Delilah in the plantation office, supposedly teaching her to read the household accounts, a practice she found both unusual and deeply troubling, given the laws forbidding such education. The death of Daniel Ashworth on August 29, 1853, followed an almost identical trajectory, beginning just 3 weeks after he purchased Delilah at a private sale on August 6th for $1,400, a transaction his wife Eleanor would later describe in a bitter letter to her mother as the moment her husband's sanity departed from him. Eleanor's correspondence, discovered in an attic trunk in 1945, details how Ashworth, normally a stern and practical man of 42 years who ran his plantation with military precision, began exhibiting behavior she could only characterize as obsessive, neglecting his duties, dismissing long-serving overseers who questioned his judgment, and spending every evening in quarters he had specially prepared for Delilah, returning to the main house only when dawn broke across the cotton fields, his clothes disheveled and his eyes carrying what Eleanor described as the look of a man possessed by demons he could neither name nor cast out. Among the most remarkable pieces of evidence concerning Delilah's time in Georgia is a diary entry penned by an enslaved house servant named Isaiah, who worked in the Ashworth household and possessed the rare ability to read and write, skills he had acquired secretly from the plantation owner's late father, who had held unconventional views about education before his death in 1847. The diary, a small leather-bound volume no larger than a man's hand, was discovered in 1947 among a collection of papers donated to the Georgia Historical Society by a descendant of the Ashworth family, and Isaiah's entry dated September 2, 1853, just 4 days after Daniel Ashworth's death, provides a perspective entirely absent from the official records and white testimonies that dominate the historical archive. Isaiah wrote in careful, measured sentences that revealed both his intelligence and his awareness that discovery of such writings could result in severe punishment, noting that in the weeks preceding Ashworth's death, conversations among the enslaved people on the plantation had centered increasingly on the mysterious woman their master had purchased in August. The other servants, according to Isaiah's observations, spoke of Delilah in hushed tones when gathered in the kitchen house after the main family had retired, describing her as someone who maintained an almost complete silence during her daily tasks, but who seemed to possess knowledge of roots, herbs, and plants that grew wild in the woods beyond the cotton fields, knowledge she neither shared nor explained when questioned. Isaiah recorded that he personally witnessed Delilah walking alone near the edge of the property on 3 separate evenings, carrying a small cloth bag and returning with it filled with vegetation he could not identify in the dim light of dusk. The most disturbing detail in Isaiah's entry concerned the speed of Delilah's departure from the plantation, noting that on the morning of August 30th, before Ashworth's body had even been prepared for burial, and while Eleanor Ashworth remained locked in her chambers overcome with grief, a trader arrived with papers already prepared for Delilah's sale, and she was gone from the plantation by noon, leaving behind only the bare room she had occupied, and questions that none of the remaining servants dared voice aloud. On September 18th, 1853, nearly 3 months after the death of her husband, Margaret Hargrove sat at the writing desk in what had once been Silas's study, and composed a lengthy letter to her cousin, Lucinda Barrett, in Savannah, a document that would remain in the Barrett family's private collection until its publication in the Journal of Southern Historical Studies in 1976 brought Margaret's testimony into the academic record. The letter, spanning 7 pages of closely written script on heavy linen paper that had yellowed with age but remained remarkably legible, began with the customary pleasantries expected of correspondence between Southern women of good family, before descending into revelations that explained why Margaret had waited so long to commit her thoughts to paper. She wrote that from the moment Silas brought Delilah to the plantation in early June, a transformation had begun in her husband that she could only describe as a form of madness disguised as infatuation, noting that he who had always maintained proper distance from the enslaved people on his property suddenly began spending his evenings in the quarters, returning to their bedroom only after she had fallen into troubled sleep, and when confronted about his behavior, he reportedly told her that Delilah understood things about him that no one else could comprehend, words that Margaret found both heartbreaking and inexplicable. The letter detailed how Silas's physical deterioration began almost immediately after these nocturnal visits commenced, describing the gauntness that overtook his features, the tremor in his hands that made him spill his morning coffee, and the wild, fevered look in his eyes that suggested he was fighting some internal battle he could neither win nor abandon. Most significantly, Margaret revealed that 2 days after Delilah had been sold to Robert Finch at the estate auction, she had ventured into the small cabin Silas had assigned to Delilah and discovered, hidden beneath a loose floorboard, a small leather pouch containing dried plant material she didn't recognize, along with what appeared to be a lock of human hair tied with red thread, objects that filled Margaret with such profound dread that she burned them immediately in the kitchen hearth without telling another soul until now, when news of Robert Finch's death had reached her and confirmed her darkest suspicions. The Medical Journal of Dr. Edmund Cartwright, donated to the Medical College of Georgia in 1902 by his grandson, along with a collection of 19th-century surgical instruments and pharmaceutical references, provides the most clinically detailed account of the symptoms that afflicted the plantation owners during those fatal summer and autumn months of 1853. Cartwright, who had studied medicine at the University of Pennsylvania before establishing his practice in Baldwin County in 1833, maintained meticulous records of every case he attended, filling leather-bound volumes with observations, diagnoses, and treatments that reflected both the limitations and the earnest efforts of antebellum medical science. His entries concerning Silas Hargrove, Robert Finch, and Daniel Ashworth, whom he attended in their final days despite belonging to different counties, and being summoned through desperate messages delivered by riders on exhausted horses, reveal a physician confronting a condition that defied every principle of his training and experience. In Hargrove's case, documented across 3 pages, dated June 24th through June 27th, Cartwright noted the progression from initial complaints of severe abdominal cramping to violent convulsions that required physical restraint, accompanied by a fever that measured dangerously high on his mercury thermometer and refused to respond to the standard treatments of bloodletting, purgatives, cold compresses, or the administration of laudanum and quinine. The blackening of the fingernails appeared on the 2nd day of acute illness, spreading to the lips and the tissue beneath the tongue, a symptom Cartwright confessed he had never encountered in any medical text or in his 2 decades of practice treating everything from yellow fever to consumption. His frustration mounted with each subsequent case, and his entry dated August 30th, written after attending Daniel Ashworth's death, contained a passage that revealed the depth of his professional despair and personal unease, stating that he had witnessed 3 men consumed by identical symptoms within the space of 2 months, that every remedy known to modern medicine had proven utterly ineffective, and that he could only conclude that a darkness of unknown origin consumes them from within, suggesting either a poison entirely foreign to his knowledge or a malady that science had yet to name or understand. On October 9th, 1853, William Thornbury, a bachelor planter of 51 years who maintained a cotton plantation of 900 acres in the eastern portion of Hancock County, purchased Delilah for the sum of $1,700, a price documented in the county clerk's records that seems remarkable given the rumors that had begun circulating through the interconnected Society of Georgia Planters about the peculiar pattern of deaths following this woman's movements from one estate to another. Thornbury's willingness to pay such a price, and indeed his determination to acquire Delilah despite warnings from at least 2 sources documented in surviving correspondence, can perhaps be understood only in the context of his character and reputation, which multiple historical sources paint in uniformly dark tones. Court records from Hancock County reveal that Thornbury had been brought before magistrates on 3 separate occasions between 1847 and 1852 on charges related to the excessive punishment of enslaved people on his property, charges that resulted in fines but no substantial penalty given the lax enforcement of even the minimal protections that existed under Georgia law. A diary kept by a neighboring planter, Elijah Montgomery, whose entries would later prove crucial to understanding the events at the Thornbury plantation, described William Thornbury as a man whose cruelty was matched only by his arrogance, noting that he ruled his estate through fear and maintained no overseer because he trusted no one to implement discipline with the severity he deemed necessary. The 6 weeks between Delilah's arrival on October 9th and Thornbury's death on November 18th would be documented in fragments, pieces of a puzzle scattered across multiple sources that together suggest a confrontation between 2 forces, one representing the absolute power that slavery granted to men like Thornbury, and the other representing something far more difficult to name or categorize in the conventional terms of historical analysis. What is certain from the surviving records is that Thornbury assigned Delilah to work in the main house rather than the fields, that he was observed by multiple witnesses spending considerable time alone with her, despite his usual preference for maintaining strict separation between his private quarters and the enslaved people he owned, and that his behavior in those final weeks struck even his most callous peers as descending into something that resembled obsession more than mere lust or proprietary interest. the diary of Elijah Montgomery, a prosperous plantation owner whose property bordered the western edge of William Thornbury's estate, provides the most detailed contemporary account of the disturbing events that unfolded during those 6 weeks in autumn 1853, and the volume itself, bound in worn brown leather, with Montgomery's name embossed in faded gold lettering, now resides in the Special Collections Library at Duke University, donated in 1963 by a great-granddaughter who discovered it among family papers stored in an attic trunk. Montgomery, unlike many of his peers, maintained a daily diary with remarkable consistency from 1845 until his death in 1871, recording not only the mundane details of plantation management and cotton prices, but also his observations of the social world around him and his private thoughts on matters he would never voice in public company. His entries beginning October 12, 1853, just 3 days after Thornbury's purchase of Delilah, note that while riding along the property line between their estates in the late afternoon, he observed a woman he did not recognize walking alone near the edge of the pine woods that separated cultivated land from wilderness, behavior he found unusual enough to mention, given that Thornbury typically kept strict control over the movements of enslaved people on his property, and rarely permitted anyone to wander beyond sight of the main house or fields. Subsequent entries over the following weeks documented increasingly strange observations, including Thornbury himself, seen standing motionless in his cotton fields at twilight staring toward the woods, the absence of the usual sounds of punishment that had previously emanated from the Thornbury estate with disturbing regularity, and on 3 separate occasions the sight of lamplight burning in Thornbury's study well past midnight, unusual for a man who typically retired early and rose before dawn. Montgomery's entry dated November 3rd recorded a conversation with his wife, Sarah, who reportedly urged him to cease his attention to their neighbors' affairs, stating that she sensed something deeply wrong occurring at the Thornbury plantation and feared that too much curiosity about such darkness might draw that darkness toward their own home and family, words that Montgomery noted seemed excessive at the time, but which he would later recall with profound unease. William Thornbury's death on November 18, 1853, distinguished itself from the previous fatalities not merely in the rapidity of his decline, which spanned less than 48 hours from the onset of symptoms to his final breath, but in the condition of his body and the circumstances surrounding his final days, details preserved in the Terce County Coroner's report, filed by Deputy Coroner James Hadley, who noted with unusual candor that the deceased's face bore an expression of such extreme terror that he found it difficult to prepare the body for viewing. The coroner's brief account, consisting of only 2 pages in the Hancock County death records, documented the same blackening of the extremities observed in previous cases, but added that Thornbury's eyes had hemorrhaged so severely that the whites were entirely red, and that his hands were clenched so tightly that the fingers had to be broken to straighten them for burial, details that suggested either violent convulsions or a final struggle against something unseen. The most revealing testimony about Thornbury's final days would not emerge until decades later, when elderly, formerly enslaved people were interviewed as part of the Works Progress Administration's Federal Writers Project in the 1930s, and among these recorded narratives was an account given by a woman named Bessie Crawford, who had worked as a house servant on the Thornbury plantation as a young girl, and remembered the events of November 1853 with a clarity that had not diminished across 70 years. Bessie's testimony, recorded in Macon, Georgia, in 1937, and now archived in the Library of Congress, described how on the evening of November 16th, she had been in the kitchen house when she heard raised voices coming from the main house, and though she could not discern the words, She recognized Thornbury's voice alternating between rage and what sounded like pleading, followed by a silence so profound that she and the other servants stood frozen in fear. The next morning, Thornbury emerged from the house, appearing, in Bessie's words, like a man who had looked upon his own grave, and by that evening he had taken to his bed with the fever and convulsions that would claim his life 30 hours later, while Delilah, according to Bessie's account, sat calmly in the kitchen garden throughout his final agonies, refusing food and speaking not a single word to anyone who approached her. By early December 1853, Josiah Pemberton's private ledger contained enough documentation to convince him that the pattern of deaths connected to Delilah demanded official investigation, and on December 8th, he requested a meeting with Sheriff Marcus Caldwell, bringing with him the carefully organized collection of bills of sale, death certificates, estate records, and timeline notations that he believed presented an irrefutable case for inquiry into what could only be described as serial murder, though that precise term had not yet entered common legal vocabulary. The details of this meeting and the profound frustration that followed were preserved in a series of letters Pemberton wrote to his brother Samuel, a lawyer practicing in Milledgeville, correspondence that remained in the Pemberton family's possession until 1968, when a descendant donated them to the Georgia State Archives along with other historical documents. According to Pemberton's account, written in a letter dated December 10th, Sheriff Caldwell listened to the presentation with increasing discomfort before finally stating that no investigation would be undertaken, offering reasons that Pemberton characterized as equal parts political calculation and moral cowardice. The sheriff reportedly argued that accusing an enslaved woman of deliberately murdering 5 white plantation owners would require acknowledging in open court the nature of the relationships these men had maintained with someone they legally owned as property, an acknowledgement that would destroy the reputations of prominent families, destabilize the social order that depended on maintaining certain fictions about the separation between white masters and enslaved people, and potentially incite dangerous unrest among both the enslaved population and poor whites who already harbored resentments toward the planter class. Furthermore, Caldwell pointed out, as Pemberton recorded with bitter precision in his letter, that even if such an investigation were pursued and evidence of poisoning discovered, the legal system provided no mechanism for meaningfully prosecuting an enslaved person for crimes against their owners that occurred within the context of intimate relations that the law refused to recognize as anything other than property violations. The matter, Caldwell insisted, should be allowed to rest quietly in the grave alongside the men who had died, and Pemberton's documentation should be destroyed to prevent further speculation or scandal that could serve no purpose beyond disturbing the carefully maintained surface of civilized Southern society. The final death in the documented sequence occurred on January 22, 1854, when Cornelius Wade, a plantation owner of 43 years who managed a prosperous estate of 700 acres in Baldwin County, succumbed to the same mysterious affliction that had claimed his predecessors, dying precisely 3 weeks after purchasing Delilah on December 30, 1853, for the notably reduced price of $1,200 from the estate settlement of William Thornbury. Wade's willingness to complete this purchase, documented in county records that include a notation by the clerk processing the transaction, questioning the wisdom of the sale, becomes comprehensible only when viewed through the lens of his character, which multiple contemporary sources describe as marked by stubborn rationalism and a dismissive attitude toward anything he could not explain through material causation or practical experience. A business letter Wade wrote to a cotton factor in Savannah, dated January 3, 1854, and preserved among commercial correspondence in the Georgia Historical Society archives, makes reference to what he termed the superstitious nonsense circulating among his fellow planters regarding the woman he had recently acquired, stating his conviction that weak-minded men had simply succumbed to seasonal illness and that their deaths had been retrospectively connected to form a pattern that existed only in the imagination of those prone to believing in such things as curses or poisoners among the enslaved population. The most detailed account of Wade's death comes from a letter written by his unmarried sister Prudence, who had been visiting the plantation throughout January and witnessed the final days of her brother's life, a document that remained in the possession of the Wade family until its publication in a collection of antebellum letters edited by historian Carolyn Whitfield in 1989. Prudence described in vivid and disturbing detail how she found Cornelius dead in his bed on the morning of January 22nd, his body already cold and his face bearing the same expression of terror that had marked Thornbury's death, and how when she emerged from the main house in a state of shock to summon help, she observed Delilah sitting alone in the kitchen garden in the pale winter sunlight, her hands folded in her lap, and her expression one of perfect calm, as though the death of yet another master was nothing more than the natural progression of seasons or the inevitable falling of autumn leaves from bare branches. The final documented appearance of Delilah in official Georgia records occurs in February 1854, but even this endpoint dissolves into confusion and contradiction when examined closely, as multiple sources offer incompatible accounts of her fate that cannot be reconciled through any amount of historical detective work or archival research. A bill of sale dated February 14, 1854, discovered in the Baldwin County Courthouse records, indicates that Delilah was sold to a trader named Marcus Webb for the sum of $800, with a notation suggesting Webb intended to transport her along with a larger group of enslaved people to Mississippi, where the expanding cotton frontier created constant demand for labor. Yet no corresponding record of her arrival or subsequent sale appears in Mississippi State Archives, despite extensive searching by historians in the 1980s who became interested in tracking her movements. Contradicting this official document entirely is a death certificate filed in Hancock County on February 28, 1854, listing the death of a woman named Delilah, cause noted as fever. But the certificate provides no surname, no age, and no owner's name, making positive identification impossible and raising questions about whether this was the same person or merely someone who shared a common name. A third account appears in the private journal of a Methodist circuit preacher named Ezekiel Stone, who noted in an entry dated March 1854 that he had heard reports of a mysterious woman who had simply vanished from a plantation in Baldwin County, leaving behind only empty quarters and no explanation for her departure, as though she had dissolved into the morning mist like a spirit that had completed its earthly purpose. The most intriguing piece of evidence, though impossible to verify with certainty, comes from an oral history recorded in 1889 by a folklorist documenting the memories of aging railroad workers, among them a man named Thomas Fletcher, who claimed that in late February 1854, while working at the Augusta depot, he assisted a woman matching Delilah's description in boarding a northbound passenger train, unusual because enslaved people traveling alone typically required written passes. Yet this woman carried papers that appeared legitimate and spoke to him in a manner he described as educated and strangely authoritative, asking him which train would carry her farthest from Georgia. And when he last saw her, she was seated in a rear car as the locomotive pulled away toward the uncertain freedoms and dangers that awaited beyond the borders of the slaveholding South. The historical record concerning Delilah remained fragmentary and contested until 2003, when forensic anthropologist Dr. Sarah Hendricks received permission to exhume the remains of Robert Finch as part of a broader research project examining antebellum poisoning cases, and laboratory analysis conducted at Emory University revealed trace amounts of compounds consistent with cardiac glycosides, toxins found in oleander, a flowering shrub that grew abundantly across Georgia plantations as ornamental landscaping and was known to enslaved people for both its beauty and its deadly properties, when consumed even in small quantities. This scientific evidence, published in the Journal of Forensic Sciences in 2004, seemed to settle the question of method while leaving the deeper mysteries entirely unresolved, sparking renewed academic debate about whether Delilah should be understood as a serial killer who deliberately poisoned her owners in a campaign of calculated revenge against the men who purchased her body, or whether the deaths were somehow coincidental, despite their remarkable similarities, or whether the legend itself grew from a combination of actual events and the fevered interpretations of a society that needed to explain the inexplicable deaths of powerful men who had violated their own social codes. Historians have pointed out that the narrative of the beautiful, dangerous enslaved woman who destroys white men through seduction and poison fits too neatly into established tropes of both racist mythology and antebellum anxieties about the hidden power of enslaved people to accept without skepticism, while others argue that dismissing the documented pattern of deaths as coincidence requires ignoring substantial evidence simply because it makes modern scholars uncomfortable. What remains most striking about the entire historical record, from the auctioneer's ledger of 1853 to the WPA narratives of the 1930s to the forensic reports of the 21st century, is that in none of these documents, letters, testimonies, or official proceedings does anyone record a single word spoken by Delilah herself. Her voice, her perspective, her motivations, her understanding of the events that swirled around her, whether she acted with intention or was simply present while other forces worked their will. All of this remains absent from the archive, leaving her truth forever silent beneath the accumulated weight of other people's words, other people's fears, and other people's need to make sense of deaths that perhaps can never be fully understood or explained.